Hey, thanks a lot, David. That was a good job of channeling the intro I was going to do before we decided to have this be a conversation. So, Todd, I just wanted to start out. You have been phenomenally successful both in business, but also in your job, first as the CTO at Department of Health and Human Services, and now as the federal CTO. Can you share some of the secrets of your success in bringing kind of the entrepreneurial energy and enthusiasm that you have to government?
Well, I've learned a whole bunch, and actually, what I'll say is that just as a backdrop, that while I had a spectacular time as a entrepreneur in the private sector, the most amazing, the most entrepreneurial experience of my entire life has been serving in the U.S. government for the last 3 years, and I've learned things about innovation in government, which I'm sure a lot of folks in the audience have also learned. But as a fellow traveler, let me just share three particular principles. One is that whenever I have an idea or I'm assigned an idea to drive a particular innovation, the first thing I do is I go to find the 3 to 5 people in government that had that idea a long time ago, right? And know a lot more about than me, know how to actually make it happen. And this is a critical step because once I find those folks, I band them together in a virtual team and say, look, I'll be your virtual CEO, which means I'll bake cookies for you, mow your lawn, block down field for you, provide you with air cover for you to do what you always want to do. And it's amazing when you put those folks in a position where they can do what they've always wanted to do, they just do incredible things. I just reminded
I think it's actually really kind of the part of the secret of Code for America. There are these change agents in government, and we're just giving them some troops.
That's right.
To help.
That's right. And so you bring in folks like Code for America fellows or like Presidential Innovation fellows to complement folks, right? But they're really working with existing change agents that are all throughout our government at every level who really are there to serve and who have amazing ideas about what to do. And if they're just given the chance, if you just unleash them to do it, they can do amazing things. And actually, I'm reminded of something I learned in the private sector, which was that there's really one thing I learned as a private sector entrepreneur, which is that if you get the best people, you win. And if you don't, it just becomes a lot more difficult, right? So, and there was one empirical characteristic that I talked about a lot that differentiated the best entrepreneurs I worked with in the private sector versus just the average or the merely good. And it's that the best entrepreneurial folks in the private sector weren't there for the stock options. They weren't there for the write-up in TechCrunch. They were there because they couldn't stand the idea of the world not having what they were building, right? And so in the moments of darkness and broken bones, every great entrepreneurial opportunity and every great entrepreneurial journey actually has, in those moments of darkness and bone snapping, right? The people who are in it for the stock options just give up and leave, right? The people who are in it for the TechCrunch write-up just go do something else, right? But the people who are there because they can't stand the idea of the world not having what they're building, they keep powering through. It's this mission orientation that really differentiates, I think, the best. And here's the thing about government, right? Folks in government are not there for the stock options. Right? They're there because they want to make a difference. And so, so folks say, well, how is it working with folks in government? I say, it's unbelievable. It is the richest vein of incredibly talented, mission-oriented people I've ever worked with, right? And so it's just phenomenal, a phenomenal set of people to work with. So one is go find the 3 to 5 change agents that are already there that you can unleash to get done what you want to get done. The second is to embrace the whole notion of agile and lean startup in government. So government, of course, is not a startup, but I think it's useful to think about change projects in government as a startup, right? And so the same kinds of principles, I always remember when you introduced me to Eric Ries, and he was describing the principles of lean startup, and I felt like someone had x-rayed my bones and basically understood every bone I had broken and why. It was telling me how I could have not broken those bones, right? So it's just an incredibly elegant code for how you can actually make change happen that's big in environments of high uncertainty, right? So the whole idea of, don't have a waterfall process where you've got, strategy and then operations and then tech, but instead recognize that strategy, ops, and tech are all different facets of actually the same problem-solving exercise, and have a team that's interdisciplinary, that has all of them represented, that actually works in a nimble way to solve the problem. So having small, focused teams that have all the disciplines, the whole notion of minimum viable product, like don't focus on the aircraft carrier that you want to launch 3 years from now, but the smallest possible thing that gets the customer to engage, so you can really start.
So how have you actually done that in government here?
Yeah. So great example, actually, which also illustrates a third principle, which is all about open innovation and the whole notion of unleashing the power of lots of other folks besides you. A great example of this is the Health Data Initiative that we launched at HHS, Department of Health and Human Services, 2 years ago, and that we continue to champion from the White House. And the whole idea there was unleash the power of data to spur entrepreneurship and innovation, like liberate data from the vaults of the government as a platform for entrepreneurship and innovation, right? And one of the things we said, look, data by itself is not useful, right? So you can't feed your baby's data, you can't pour data on a wound and heal it, you can't pour data on a road and fix it. Data is only useful if it gets applied to generate actual public benefit. And to generate public benefit, it actually needs appliers. So you need to engage the appliers from the beginning to understand, well, what data do you have that's really useful? Like, what should you do to make that data really usable, right? So what we did was we said, okay, well, what's our minimum viable product, right? What's actually the initial set of stuff we can make available or make more usable to get people to actually pay attention? And so we looked at hospital quality data and directories of where all the healthcare providers were, community health data, and we gathered about 45 entrepreneurs in a room. Many very quite skeptical, and put this initial set of data on the table and said, okay, well, what would you do with this data? And they started working with the data, and 90 days later, we had our first Health Datapalooza to showcase what people did with it, which was amazing. And we iterated from there.
I have to say, that was just such a remarkable experience because, that notion of, finding the entrepreneurs. So many times when we open data, we're kind of throwing it out there, and I think a lot of the initial open data efforts from government, faltered because it was too much data without enough attention paid to who might need it. And I thought that was a fantastic process where you actually brought together people who had the data and people who might be able to use it, did this sort of private process. So then when you kind of announced the open data program, you actually had a bunch of use cases.
And it actually it did a number of things. One, it made the data really concrete for folks. They really understood the data sets that were being made available because you actually see an app that helped you find the right hospital for your family. And it also actually was a wonderful asset when it came to convincing more people inside government to liberate data, right? Because we were actually not just engaging entrepreneurs who could use data, but also people inside government to try to make them release more data. And one of the things we had heard early on was from a lot of data owners inside government was that, I don't know about this open data thing, because what happens if I make my data available? I can only imagine horribleness. I can't imagine awesomeness. And so prove to me the awesomeness will happen. And so we brought a lot of government data owners to this Datapalooza, and they said, oh my gosh, right? People actually took the data that was made available and turned it into all kinds of apps and services that help improve access to healthcare, help improve quality of care, et cetera. So they started liberating more data, which then led to more products and services being built, which then led to more data being liberated. And it just spiraled upward from an initial minimum viable product into the most recent Health Datapalooza in June of this year, where 1,600 entrepreneurs and innovators got into the Washington Convention Center, and over the course of 2 days, saw a huge array of amazing products and services built on open data from the government. 242 companies competed in an American Idol style process for 100 spots to actually showcase their products and services for these 600 folks. And it actually happened in a virtuous spiral.
Yeah, that's kind of an interesting point. You're really trying to build a commercial ecosystem around government data. So it's not just, okay, let's come up with new government programs. It's actually how by treating government as a platform, you can actually create more private sector activity to achieve the goals of government.
That's right. That's 100% right. And this really speaks to the kind of the third thing that we've really learned is the power of open innovation, right? And like the way that I best kind of understand open innovation is by thinking through the implications of Joy's law, right, which we talk about all the time. This is named after Bill Joy, who co-founded Sun Microsystems. And Bill Joy once said, no matter who you are, you have to remember that most of the smartest people in the world work for somebody else, which is, of course, always true, right? I mean, I don't think I'll ever work for another organization other than the U.S. government, right, that will ever have as many brilliant people as the U.S. government has across NIH and DARPA, et cetera. But even the U.S. government is outnumbered by the rest of the planet Earth. right? And so if you want to maximize social return on our data, right, don't just have our own people or a set of other people who are in the know take our data and turn it into tools that are useful for folks, right? Open it up as a platform and spread the word about it so everyone else on the planet who cares about health, education, energy, public safety, global development can take that data and turn it into all kinds of stuff that we couldn't even imagine, let alone build, right? So for example, these 242 companies that were the latest to kind of throw their hat in the ring for the Health Datapalooza, total taxpayer expenditure to support them, 0.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, so there's no legislation that was required. There's no regulation that was required. There's no new expenditure of taxpayer capital really required. You're just taking data that taxpayers already paid for and giving it back to them in machine-readable form and actually promoting it so that entrepreneurs tap into it and then turn it into new products and jobs. Yeah. And it's a play we're now running across multiple other sectors as well, besides health.
So you mentioned a session you ran recently with a bunch of companies that are just talking about how vital government data is to their business. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So we've been doing a lot of this, and one recent meetup was with a set of open data entrepreneurs across energy, education, health, safety, and finance. And they were talking about how government data is a vital resource for them in terms of their future growth and their success. And we were brainstorming about how to actually kind of take the ecosystem to the next level. It was a conversation that happened very recently, and so we're still kind of thinking through the implications of what was said. But one of the interesting insights that they had was in talking with each other, they realized that there really isn't an open data silo for health and then a separate one for energy and a separate one for education and a separate one for safety, that there's a huge amount of common interest and commonality across them. And so thinking about the ecosystem not as a series of fragmented ecosystems, but actually as a broad integrated ecosystem was actually very useful. Yeah. And so, for example, we've been holding convocations, meetups, and hackathons that focus on health, education, energy, but maybe we should actually kind of as an ecosystem, right? Because it's not just us, but companies and foundations who've been holding these hackathons and meetups. Maybe we should cross-pollinate, for example, right? Yeah. There's this whole notion of how the word about open data could be spread by more than just us, right? How there could be open data ambassadors, right, who really begin to drive word about the data and use of the data more broadly. One interesting factoid I recently learned about was that one of the most successful, apparently, open data communities is actually the weather data community. Yeah. And it's actually not run by the National Weather Service. It's actually run by all the people that use the data. Yeah. And people show up every now and then from the government to actually answer a really hard question or correct a particular point, but it's actually completely self-propelled. And so I think trying to figure out how can we collectively, across the public, private, academic, nonprofit sector can catalyze a increasingly self-propelled ecosystem, right, that is increasingly viral, I think is just a wonderful, wonderful set of opportunities to think about.
Yeah, so one thing I wanted to talk a little bit about is procurement and the notion that people in government fight with, that so many of the problems, particularly using technology, are very expensive. Yeah. We heard in the session on New Orleans where the mayor thought that the blight status problem couldn't really be solved, just the information. He said, I ought to be able to walk around with an iPad and have this information, but I thought it would take $30 million and many years. And instead they were able to build something quickly that actually solved that problem with a lot of existing data and just simple integration. Yeah. That notion, though, that I think holds people up. How have you dealt with that at the federal level? That just the resistance from the companies that are selling the multi-million-dollar, or in the case of the federal government, multi-billion-dollar solutions to what can be done, quickly by small teams of innovative developers.
Yeah. So one of the projects we recently launched under our Presidential Innovation Fellows Program is called RFP-EZ. Yeah. And it's a project that in 6 months is seeking to prototype a solution to the problem that tech startups don't sell to the government right now. In fact, VCs actively instruct tech startups not to try to sell the federal government because it's such a massive red tape, and it's just a time sink from their perspective. And this is a huge problem because A, it deprives the startups of a $80 billion a year IT market, and B, it deprives the government of their solutions, right? So a lot of the stuff that I was used to buying as a private sector entrepreneur, I can't buy in the government because the startups don't want to sell to the government, which is kind of crazy, right? So RPEZ is developing a really interesting and powerful process and online platform to actually attack this problem. And so first of all, they've picked a zone of spending, which is $150,000 or less. Because in that zone, it turns out you can evaporate a ton of red tape. And B, they've built the ability to have government folks easily describe and post in language that tech startups understand what they're looking for. Like apparently the federal government describes a website as an information management and retrieval system, right? And if a private sector company looked at that, they would say, that doesn't sound like a website to me. So there's that, the kind of language translator and kind of packaging of the opportunity. And then C, they're constructing the ability for private sector folks to very easily post bids against that, and also a marketplace where private sector solutions can be listed so government folks can actually browse what's actually out there. And it's interesting because there have been multiple conversations we've had where it's becoming increasingly clear that a lot of folks in government, because they haven't been sold to, because they haven't been exposed to tech startups, don't even know what's possible from a value and cost standpoint, right? So one government person actually literally was challenging a person on the RPEZ team, one of the fellows, saying, you tell me a single company out there, a single one, that will sell us a website for less than $1 million. And the fellow said, all of them, all of them. but we have to make that a non-abstract academic fact, right? And
all of them except the existing federal contractors.
So if you have an online marketplace that actually has that, right? And so people can see that and make it real for folks, right?
That's right.
This thing will go viral. Okay, across government, because just like every other level of government, federal government has to do more with less, right? So people are looking for ways to do more with less, right?
So
if we present the
big part of what we're all trying to do are finding those success stories and then evangelizing them. Which of course a lot of what this event is about. Kind of saying, wow, here's what we did. You can do it too.
Absolutely. And I think there are a ton of success stories out there, like a ton.
How do you think about open source in the federal government, open source software?
So we're embracing it big time, and in fact, there is another interesting sort of set of anecdotes I could tell you, but where people in the government have asked us, are we allowed to do open source? Yes, yes, in fact you are, right? So, but there are also kind of big ticket moves the government's making, like for example, Vista is the VA's the electronic health record, and it historically has been kind of quasi-open in the sense that you could FOIA to get the code. And there was this kind of quasi-industry of people FOIAing the code, but it was just very suboptimal. So the VA actually recently, under the leadership of CTO Peter Levin, said we're going to create a open source repository, and boom, put the code there, right? And there are hundreds of companies that have dialed in, actually scrubbing on the code, and so we're making big steps forward. But open source is a key part of the future, the present and the future of technology and government.
Well, I'll talk a little bit about government and cloud services.
So as Vivek Kundra, the previous CIO, and his successor, Stephen Rokel, the current US CIO, are all in on cloud first, right? So if it can be done in cloud, do that first. And again, I think it's both about policy change, but also about culture change, and culture change spreading through stories. We're finding that stories are the thing that's most powerful. So let me just tell you one story, for example. I remember actually when I was at HHS, now CTO, a team came to me and said, we've got this problem. We have to, by statute, implement X, Y, Z thing, right? We've costed it out, how much it would cost to build the system. It's going to be $4.7 million. We don't have $4.7 million. Can you help us make it cost less? I took a look at it and said, have you heard of, and I named a number of companies. I said, they've actually built this in the cloud as software as a service. And if you really have a complex data model that requires a lot of customization, you throw in 3 years of maintenance operations, maybe it'll cost you $500,000, maybe, And they said, no. I said, well, yes. They said, no. I said, well, no, really, I'm not joking. So they actually went, to their credit, to check it out. And they said, I'll be damned. And for $470,000, they actually got a fantastic product and 3 years of operations and maintenance, right? And that team will never approach any IT procurement the same way ever again, right? So getting back to RPEZ, one good is that there's a whole bunch of stuff that you can buy for less than $150K, right? That we're going to start buying all across the government. But it'll also introduce a whole new set of technological solutions into the minds of government. So even if they're actually looking for something that costs more than that, they'll say, there's software as a service. There's open source, right? There are people who are incredibly good who cost very little. So maybe I should challenge, even in other realms of procurement, what I should be doing, right? So it's an awareness and socialization issue. But let me tell you what, I mean, it's not about sort of changing the mindset of the people in government. People in government want to save money. They want to get the maximum bang for taxpayer buck, right? There have been institutional barriers stopping them from doing that. And so I think if you actually remove those barriers and actually show people what's possible, I mean, they'll move very quickly in that direction.
Are you open to taking questions from the audience?
Absolutely, yeah.
So I don't know if let me ask you another question while we get people queued up and get a mic. I want to ask briefly about again, about the Presidential Innovation Fellows. You mentioned, what can you do in 6 months? That was one of your filters. Was that, when you look for departments and projects, it was looking for those quick wins. I know that's also, that concept of quick wins has been a big part of, Code for America. Go in and figure out small things that you can do that will just show that what's possible.
Right, and even if you're actually tackling something big, pick something small that you do as a minimum viable product first to show that progress is possible. So I think, for example, if you look at each of the projects, I mean, they're actually pretty big. Like Open Data Initiatives is a big project, opening up our data to actually support entrepreneurship. RFPEZ, aims to really implement lightweight tech procurement kind of across the landscape, right? I mean, Better Than Cash seeks to catalyze a move of the last mile of development assistance payment from cash to mobile. Like MyGov seeks to reimagine the relationship between citizens and government by creating a single platform, prototype of a single platform that enables you to access as a citizen the information services you need from across government, as opposed to spelunking through 24,000 different websites to try to figure out where stuff is. But in each of these, right, the teams have defined a near-term deliverable, which is concrete and which will work, which will show what you can do, in 6 months, and actually meaningfully move the needle on the outcome desired, and actually lay the groundwork for what happens next. And I think that's just absolutely critical. Absolutely critical.
All right. Do we have a question? Yeah.
All right. So.
Identify yourself, please.
Kerry Hedger, City of Macon, again.
Hello.
And I realize this is probably a little bit different on the local scale. When I was in the private industry, we were big on cloud, disaster recovery, it's great. But for the city government, we kind of operate in a thought that the rest of the world has blown up into a huge nuclear disaster, and we're the only ones left. And so the only way to get away with that is to have our own servers in-house and to have our own VM centers and all that good stuff. From a disaster recovery, like a Katrina-style huge city engulfing event, how do you involve cloud and not cloud? What shouldn't you do? What should you do? Caveats, suggestions?
Yeah, no, I actually think, quite honestly, that scenario is a perfect one in which to illustrate the value of cloud, right? So, I mean, if, God forbid, there should be a significant natural disaster in your area, right? There's a high probability that if you have everything local, right, I mean, it'll get taken out. And so, there are, just in the healthcare space, for example, there have been a lot of examples recently where in Katrina or the tornado that hit Joplin, that the only folks whose health records actually survived intact were the ones whose health records were not physically in Joplin or physically actually in New Orleans, but were actually in the cloud, secure somewhere else. And so I think that the notion of actually cloud being among all the other benefits, a strategy for preparing for and surviving in terms of your infrastructure, your data disasters, I think is actually very compelling.
I actually remember that I was at a talk at a healthcare meeting with the Surgeon General, and she had formerly run, I think, a clinic in Mississippi, something like that. And there was a big flood, and a lot of the records were destroyed, and the rest of them, she showed them drying in the sun.
Drying, that's right. I see the picture. Yeah. Fans, all these records.
Right. And she said this was a HIPAA violation, but that was the least of it.
That was the least of the
they
issues.
Just had them all spread out on the lawn.
Yeah. No, I think so. I think cloud is an important emergency preparedness strategy on top of all the
So it's actually the reverse of what you're saying. Do we have other questions here?
Hi, Todd.
Hi.
Jason Hibbets with Red Hat. Great to hear that open source is part of the future of government. Yeah. Can you comment on the difference between the federal government consuming open source, contributing to open source, and then basically creating open source software? And I'm thinking particularly the DoD Accumulo project.
So I'm not familiar with the Accumulo project, but I would say that just in general, I mean, we're all in on all of the above, right? So I mean, using software, open sourcing software. I mean, like for example, just as one example, each of the Presidential Innovation Fellows projects is doing all of their work on GitHub. All the code is being published via GitHub. Actually, RPEZ is an interesting example of this. Cities have taken great interest in the RPEZ platform, and I think that actually there may be a couple cities that implement it before we do, which would be great. So, but I think we're all in on each of the dimensions. That
GitHub is such a powerful tool for change. I think we're out of time, but I want to just ask, is there any last piece of advice that you would give the people here in the room for, just.
So here's what I would say. I think most of you are actually in public service, and what I just want to say from the bottom of my heart, not as you as CTO, but as an American, is thank you so much for what you are doing. It's an incredibly tough job, always has been, is particularly tough now as we face rising demands and dwindling resources. And what's really going to keep powering us to ever greater levels of success is the innovative spirit and ingenuity of the incredible public servants that we've got at every level of government. So I just can't tell you over the last 3 years how many amazing people I've met at every level of government. Yeah. And they give me enormous faith in the future of government in America and the future of this country. And I just can't thank you enough. So God bless you for all the work that you've done. May the force be with you as you keep doing ever better work. Thank you so much. God bless you, and God bless America. Thank you for everything you're doing.
Thank you very much.